At my daughter's wedding, my son-in-law introduced me to his wealthy father as the unemployed old loser. His father looked at me, smiled, and said to his son, "I know him. He's the billionaire lead investor in my company." What I did next. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. I've been to many weddings in my 61 years, but none had prepared me for the humiliation I would face at my own daughter's. The church was beautiful that Saturday afternoon. Sophie looked radiant in her grandmother's lace dress, the same one my late wife Margaret had worn 35 years ago. I should have been the proudest father in the world watching my only child marry the man she loved. Instead, I found myself standing in the corner of the reception hall, nursing a warm beer and trying to process what had just happened. "Dad, come meet Joshua's father," Sophie had said, her face glowing with happiness as she pulled me toward a distinguished man in an expensive suit. Joshua Pemberton stepped forward, his arm possessively around my daughter's waist. I'd never warmed to him in the 2 years they'd been together. There was something about the way he looked at people, like he was calculating their worth based on their clothes and cars. But Sophie loved him, and that's all that mattered to me. "Mr. Pemberton," Joshua said to his father, his voice carrying that tone I'd grown to recognize, the one he used when he wanted to impress someone. "I'd like you to meet Sophie's father, Paul Henderson." His father, Richard Pemberton, extended his hand with a polite smile. I'd seen that face before, though I was certain he wouldn't remember me. Joshua continued, and this is where my world tilted sideways. "He's the old, unemployed loser I was telling you about. Been out of work for years now. Sophie's always worried about him. You know how it is with deadbeat dads." The words hit me like a physical blow. Sophie's face went pale, but she didn't correct him. She just stood there, her eyes darting between Joshua and me, clearly mortified but unwilling to defend her own father in front of her new in-laws. Richard Pemberton's expression shifted. His polite smile faded, replaced by something I couldn't quite read. He studied my face more carefully, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Actually," Richard said slowly, his voice taking on a different tone entirely, "I know exactly who this is." Joshua smirked, clearly pleased that his father was acknowledging what he saw as my obvious failures. "Yeah, Sophie's been carrying the financial burden for both of them. It's been really hard on her." I felt my chest tighten, not just from Joshua's cruelty, but from watching my daughter's face crumble with embarrassment. She believed what he was saying about me. After all these years, she actually believed I was a failure. Richard looked directly at me, then back at his son. "Joshua, you have no idea who you're talking about, do you?" "What do you mean?" Joshua's confidence wavered just slightly. "This man," Richard said, his voice now carrying a note of respect that made several nearby guests turn their heads, "is the principal investor in Pemberton Industries. He's the silent partner who's been keeping our company afloat for the past 15 years. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Joshua's face go through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked like panic. Sophie stared at me, her mouth slightly open. "Dad?" I'd spent decades building my wealth quietly, living modestly, driving my old truck, wearing simple clothes. I'd done it deliberately, wanting my children to understand the value of hard work and humility. But standing there, watching my daughter's shock turn to something that might have been shame, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. Richard extended his hand to me again, this time with genuine warmth. "Mr. Henderson, it's an honor to finally meet you in person. Your investment strategies have been brilliant, truly brilliant." Joshua's face had gone completely white. He opened his mouth, then closed it, looking like a fish out of water. I took Richard's hand, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Please, call me Paul." The crowd around us had grown larger, drawn by the obvious tension and Richard's unexpected announcement. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, could hear the whispered conversations starting up. Sophie reached for my arm. "Dad, I don't understand. You've been living in that little apartment, driving that old truck." "Because that's all I need," I said quietly, looking into her eyes and seeing my late wife's confusion reflected there. Joshua finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. You're rich?" I didn't answer him directly. Instead, I looked at Richard. "I think we should talk privately sometime this week." Richard nodded, understanding immediately. "Of course, my office, whenever convenient for you." As the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with conversation, I found myself alone with Sophie and Joshua. My daughter looked like she might cry, and Joshua looked like he might be sick. "Dad," Sophie began, but I held up my hand gently. "Today is your wedding day," I said, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "We'll talk about this later." But as I walked away, heading toward the parking lot and my old Ford pickup, I could hear Joshua behind me, his voice desperate as he tried to explain to Sophie, tried to minimize what had just happened. I sat in my truck for a long time before starting the engine, my hand shaking slightly as I gripped the steering wheel. For 15 years, I'd been the anonymous investor who'd saved Richard Pemberton's company from bankruptcy. For 15 years, I'd watched from the shadows as his business thrived with my capital behind it. And for the past 2 years, I'd listened to his son insult me, belittle me, and turn my own daughter against me, all while having no idea that his comfortable lifestyle depended entirely on my money. The irony was almost too much to bear. But as I drove home to my modest apartment, I realized something had fundamentally changed today. I was tired of being invisible, tired of being treated like a burden by the man who'd married my daughter. Joshua had no idea what he'd just unleashed. The morning after Sophie's wedding, I sat in my small kitchen with my usual cup of black coffee, staring at the newspaper I wasn't really reading. My mind kept drifting back to that moment when Richard Pemberton recognized me, when everything I'd worked so hard to keep private suddenly became public. I hadn't always lived this way. There was a time when I was just like everyone else thought I was now, struggling, barely making ends meet, wondering how I'd provide for my family. Margaret and I had been married for 3 years when Sophie was born. I was working construction then, my hands raw and calloused, my back aching every night. We lived in a tiny rental house with a leaky roof and a furnace that broke down every winter. Margaret would joke that we were rich in love while counting coins to buy groceries. But I had dreams bigger than my circumstances. Every evening after work, while Margaret fed Sophie and got her ready for bed, I'd spread financial newspapers across our kitchen table. I taught myself to read stock reports, studied market trends, learned about companies most people had never heard of. My first investment was $300 I'd saved from overtime work. Margaret thought I was crazy, risking money we could barely afford to lose on something I knew nothing about. But I'd been watching a small manufacturing company in Ohio, studying their quarterly reports, tracking their expansion plans. When I bought those shares, Margaret didn't speak to me for 2 days. 6 months later, that $300 had become $800. Margaret still thought it was luck. It wasn't luck. It was research, patience, and an understanding that most people invest with their emotions, while smart money invests with cold logic. I started small, reinvesting every profit, never touching the principal. While my neighbors bought new cars and bigger houses, I kept driving my beat-up truck and living in our modest home. When Sophie was 5, I had my first real breakthrough. I'd been tracking a tech company that was developing new software for businesses. Everyone thought they were too small to succeed, but I saw something in their business model that reminded me of the construction industry. They were solving a problem that every company had, but nobody was addressing efficiently. I invested everything I had, nearly $5,000 by then. Margaret was furious. We had our biggest fight ever that night. Harsh words said that we both regretted. She accused me of gambling with our daughter's future, of being selfish and reckless. 3 years later, that company was bought by IBM for 30 times what it had been worth. Suddenly, we had more money than either of us had ever imagined. That's when I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. Instead of buying a mansion or expensive cars, instead of quitting my construction job and living like a wealthy man, I chose to stay invisible. Why? Margaret had asked me one evening as we sat on our old couch, a check for more money than we'd made in the previous 10 years sitting on the coffee table between us. Because I want Sophie to learn the value of hard work, I told her. I want her to understand that character matters more than money. If she grows up knowing we're wealthy, she'll never develop the strength she'll need when life gets difficult. Margaret was skeptical, but she agreed to try it my way. We moved to a slightly better apartment, nothing flashy. I kept working construction during the day and investing at night. To everyone who knew us, we were just a working-class family getting by. But behind the scenes, my portfolio was growing exponentially. I became the silent partner in dozens of companies, the anonymous investor who could make or break a business deal. I developed relationships with CEOs who knew me only by voice and reputation, never by face. Richard Pemberton's company had been one of my biggest success stories. 15 years ago, Pemberton Industries was drowning in debt, facing bankruptcy after a series of bad decisions and market downturns. Richard had exhausted every traditional funding source when my investment firm reached out to him. I'd been watching his company for months, studying their fundamentals. They had good products, solid management, and a loyal customer base. Their only problem was cash flow. It was exactly the kind of situation I specialized in, a fundamentally sound company that just needed patient capital to survive a temporary crisis. I invested $2 million, becoming the majority silent partner. The agreement was simple. I would provide capital and strategic guidance through intermediaries, but I would never interfere with day-to-day operations, and my identity would remain confidential. Over the years, I'd watched Richard rebuild his company into a major player in their industry. I'd watched him hire his son Joshua straight out of college, grooming him to eventually take over the business. I'd seen the Pemberton family's lifestyle improve dramatically as the company's profits soared. What Richard didn't know was that I'd been watching his son for the past 2 years, ever since Joshua started dating Sophie. I'd seen how he talked about money, how he treated service workers, how he looked down on people he considered beneath him. I'd listened to him brag about his father's success as if he'd had anything to do with building it. But I'd stayed silent, hoping that love would change him, hoping that Sophie's influence would help him develop some humility and character. I was wrong. Yesterday's humiliation at the wedding had shown me exactly who Joshua really was. He wasn't just arrogant and entitled, he was cruel. He was willing to destroy my relationship with my daughter to make himself look better to his father. I finished my coffee and walked to my home office, a spare bedroom where I kept my computer and files. On the wall hung a single framed photograph, Margaret holding baby Sophie in the hospital, both of them looking at me with such love and trust that it still took my breath away. Margaret had died of cancer when Sophie was 16. I'd spent her college fund on treatments that didn't work, used every resource I had trying to save her. Sophie never knew that her mother's medical bills had eaten through hundreds of thousands of dollars, never knew that I'd liquidated investments to pay for experimental treatments. After Margaret died, I'd thrown myself back into investing with renewed focus. I'd rebuilt everything I'd lost and more, but the loneliness was crushing. Sophie was all I had left, and Joshua was systematically poisoning our relationship. I opened my laptop and pulled up the files on Pemberton Industries. My investment had grown to nearly $12 million over the years. I owned 47% of the company, enough to have significant influence over major decisions, including personnel decisions. As I scrolled through the quarterly reports, I made a mental note of Joshua's position in the company. He was Vice President of Business Development, a job his father had created for him that came with a substantial salary and impressive title, but relatively little actual responsibility. A job that existed entirely at the discretion of the board of directors. A job that could disappear with a single phone call. I closed the laptop and stared at Margaret's picture. "What would you do?" I asked her, just like I had countless times over the past 5 years. The answer came to me clearly, in her voice: protect our daughter. Joshua had made his choice yesterday when he decided to humiliate me in front of my family. He'd shown me exactly what kind of man he was, exactly how he planned to treat me now that he was part of our family. It was time for him to learn that actions have consequences. 3 weeks after the wedding, I found myself sitting across from Sophie in a small cafe downtown, watching my daughter fidget with her wedding ring as she avoided making eye contact with me. She'd finally agreed to meet after I'd called her 4 times, and even then, she'd insisted on a public place rather than inviting me to the home she now shared with Joshua. "Dad, I need to ask you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is what Mr. Pemberton said at the wedding really true? Are you actually wealthy?" I finished for her, taking a sip of my coffee. "Yes, Sophie, I am." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears. "But why? Why did you let me think you were struggling? Why did you let me send you money every month when I could barely afford it myself?" That hurt more than Joshua's insults had. For the past 3 years, since she'd started her nursing job, Sophie had been putting $50 a month into my bank account. I'd tried to refuse it, but she'd insisted, saying she wanted to help her father, who was having such a hard time. I'd donated every penny to charity, but I'd never told her that. "Because I wanted you to become the woman you are," I said quietly. "Strong, independent, compassionate. If you'd grown up knowing about the money, would you have worked so hard to put yourself through nursing school? Would you have developed the empathy that makes you such a good nurse?" Sophie wiped her eyes with a napkin. "But I felt so guilty, Dad. All these years, I thought I wasn't doing enough for you. Joshua kept telling me that I needed to take better care of you, that it was embarrassing how you lived." My jaw tightened. "Joshua said that?" "He said a lot of things." Sophie's voice became smaller. "He said it reflected poorly on him that his father-in-law was unemployed. He kept pushing me to get you to apply for jobs. Said it made him look bad when his coworkers asked about family." I felt a cold anger building in my chest. Not only had Joshua been humiliating me, but he'd been using my supposed failures to manipulate my daughter, making her feel guilty and ashamed of her own father. "What else has he said, Sophie?" She hesitated, glancing around the cafe as if Joshua might materialize out of thin air. "He said that after we got married, we might need to have boundaries, that it wasn't healthy for me to keep enabling your lifestyle." "Enabling my lifestyle," I repeated slowly. "He said successful people surround themselves with other successful people, and that having someone like you too involved in our lives could hurt his career prospects." I set my coffee cup down carefully, afraid that if I gripped it any tighter, it might shatter. "And what did you tell him?" Sophie's face crumpled. "I told him you were a good man who'd had some bad luck. I defended you, Dad, but he has a way of making his arguments sound so logical. He talks about studies showing how family dynamics affect professional success, about how important image is in his industry." "His industry," I said, almost laughing at the irony. "Sophie, do you know what Joshua actually does at Pemberton Industries?" She looked confused. "He's vice president of business development. He's been working on some major deals, traveling to meet with potential clients." I pulled out my phone and opened my email, scrolling to a message I'd received the day before from Richard Pemberton's assistant. It was the monthly report I received as the company's primary investor, detailing financial performance and key personnel updates. "Joshua hasn't closed a single deal in the 8 months he's been in that position," I told her. "According to the company's internal reports, his department has actually lost 3 major clients due to what the report calls unprofessional behavior and unrealistic promises." Sophie stared at me. "That can't be right. He talks about his successes all the time. Just last week, he said he was about to close a deal worth $500,000. There is no $500,000 deal, Sophie. His father has been covering for him, giving him busy work and hoping he'll eventually mature into the role." I watched my daughter's face as this information sank in. The confusion, the dawning realization that the man she'd married had been lying to her about something as fundamental as his professional competence. "How do you know all this?" she asked weakly. I closed my phone and leaned forward. "Because I'm the one who gets those reports, Sophie. I'm the one who's been keeping that company afloat for 15 years. The silence stretched between us. I could see her mind working, trying to reconcile everything she thought she knew with this new reality. "Dad," she said finally, "why are you telling me this now?" "Because your husband humiliated me at your wedding, and he's been poisoning our relationship for 2 years based on lies and assumptions. Because he's making you feel guilty for taking care of a father who doesn't need taking care of. And because I think you deserve to know who you really married." Sophie's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, and her face went pale. "What is it?" I asked. "It's from Joshua. He wants to know where I am and who I'm with." She showed me the message. "Where are you? I thought you were running errands. Need you home by 6 for dinner with the Hendersons." "Oh, the Hendersons?" "Another couple from his work. He likes to network." Sophie was already gathering her purse, that familiar look of anxiety crossing her face that I'd been seeing more and more often since the wedding. "Sophie, you don't have to." "I do, Dad. You don't understand. He gets really upset when plans change unexpectedly." She stood up, then hesitated. Can we talk about all this later? I need time to process." I nodded, though every instinct was telling me to grab her hand and tell her not to go home to him. "Of course, but Sophie—" She paused. "You know you can call me any time, right? Day or night, for any reason." She smiled, but it was the same sad smile I'd been seeing from her for months. "I know, Dad. I love you." After she left, I sat in the cafe for another hour, watching through the window as people hurried past on the sidewalk. Normal people living normal lives, not hiding massive wealth, not watching their daughters marry men who treated them like burdens. My phone rang. Richard Pemberton's name appeared on the screen. "Paul, I hope I'm not disturbing you." Richard's voice was warm, but carried an undertone of stress. "I was wondering if we could move up our meeting. Something's come up that I'd like to discuss with you as soon as possible." "What kind of something?" "It's about Joshua. There's been an incident with a client, and frankly, I'm not sure how much longer I can protect him. The board is starting to ask questions about his performance, and I'm running out of excuses." I looked out the window again, watching a young couple walk by holding hands, laughing about something. They reminded me of Sophie and Joshua when they'd first started dating, before I'd seen Joshua's true nature emerge. "Richard," I said, "I think it's time we had a very frank conversation about your son's future with the company." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I was afraid you might say that." "My office tomorrow morning at 10. "And Richard, this conversation stays between us until I decide otherwise." After I hung up, I realized that the game was already in motion. Joshua had been playing with fire for 2 years, not knowing that he was standing in a powder keg. Tomorrow, I would begin to show him exactly what happened when you underestimate the quiet man in the corner. But first, I needed to make sure Sophie would be okay when her world started falling apart. Because one way or another, Joshua's house of cards was about to collapse, and I wouldn't let my daughter get buried in the rubble. Richard Pemberton looked older than his 63 years as he sat across from me in my downtown office the next morning. His usually impeccable suit was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept much. "Paul, I'll be direct," he said, accepting the coffee my assistant had brought. "Joshua cost us the Morrison account yesterday. 2 years of relationship building gone because he promised them delivery timelines we couldn't possibly meet and pricing that would have us losing money on every unit." I leaned back in my chair, studying the man whose company I'd saved from bankruptcy 15 years ago. Richard was a good businessman, ethical and hardworking, but he had one fatal flaw. He couldn't see his son clearly. "How much was the Morrison account worth?" I asked. $3.2 million annually, but that's not the worst part." Richard rubbed his forehead. "Morrison called me personally. He said Joshua was arrogant, dismissive of their concerns, and acted like the deal was beneath him. He specifically requested that if we want to maintain any relationship going forward, Joshua cannot be involved." I wasn't surprised. I'd been quietly monitoring Joshua's performance for months, and this was just the latest in a series of disasters. The young man seemed to believe that his father's position in the company gave him license to treat clients and colleagues with contempt. "What's the board saying?" I asked. Richard's shoulders sagged. "They're asking for his resignation. Tom Bradley called me last night, said the other members are concerned about nepotism affecting company performance. They want him out by the end of the month." I sipped my coffee, considering my options. The board could recommend Joshua's termination, but as the majority investor, I had the final say. I could override their decision, protect Joshua for Sophie's sake, continue enabling his behavior, or I could let natural consequences take their course. Richard, can I ask you something personal? He nodded. Do you think Joshua understands the value of hard work? Do you think he appreciates what you've built? Richard was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, I don't think he's ever had to struggle for anything. I wanted to give him opportunities I never had, but I'm afraid I may have done him a disservice. What do you mean? He talks about the company like it's his birthright, like success is owed to him. He doesn't understand that everything we have could disappear if we don't treat our clients with respect and deliver on our promises. I thought about my conversation with Sophie the day before, about how Joshua had been manipulating her feelings of guilt about my supposed financial situation, using her love for her father as a weapon against her. Richard, has Joshua ever talked to you about my daughter's family situation? Richard looked confused. What do you mean? At the wedding, he introduced me as an unemployed loser who was a financial burden on Sophie. He's apparently been telling her for years that my poverty was embarrassing to him, that it reflected poorly on his professional image. Richard's face went red. Paul, I had no idea. I'm so sorry. That's completely unacceptable. The irony is that he was saying this while his comfortable lifestyle was being subsidized by my investment in your company. He was insulting the man who was indirectly paying his salary. I pulled out a folder containing Joshua's performance reviews, client feedback reports, and financial impact statements. I'd had my people compile everything over the past week. This is what I know about your son's actual performance, I said, sliding the folder across the desk. Richard opened it and began reading. With each page, his expression grew more grim. Lost clients, missed deadlines, unprofessional behavior documented by multiple colleagues, inflated expense reports, and a pattern of promising things the company couldn't deliver. My God, he whispered. I knew there were problems, but I didn't realize the scope. Your son has cost Pemberton Industries approximately $8 million in lost revenue over the past year, I said quietly. If he were anyone else's child, he would have been fired months ago. Richard closed the folder and looked at me with something that might have been relief mixed with resignation. What do you want me to do? I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city. Down below, people were going about their daily lives, working hard, treating each other with basic respect, not assuming that the world owed them anything. I want you to run your company the way you would if Joshua weren't your son, I said. I want you to make the decision that's best for Pemberton Industries, not the decision that protects Joshua from the consequences of his actions. You're saying I should let the board terminate him. I turned back to face him. I'm saying you should do what any responsible CEO would do with an employee who has this performance record. Richard sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the folder. Finally, he looked up at me. Paul, there's something else you should know. Joshua has been telling people that he's going to inherit significant wealth from Sophie's side of the family. I felt my stomach drop. What? He's been bragging to colleagues that Sophie's father left her a substantial inheritance that they'll have access to soon. He's been using this supposed inheritance as leverage in his social circles, even mentioned it to potential clients as evidence of his family's financial stability. The audacity was breathtaking. Not only had Joshua been disparaging me as a poor, unemployed failure, but he'd simultaneously been claiming that I'd left Sophie wealthy. He was literally trying to have it both ways, using my supposed poverty to make himself look like a generous provider, while using my supposed wealth to make himself look financially secure. Does Sophie know about this? I asked. I don't think so. But Paul, if Joshua is terminated, if his lifestyle changes dramatically, he's going to start asking questions. He's been spending money like someone who expects a significant windfall. I walked back to my desk and sat down heavily. This was worse than I'd thought. Joshua wasn't just a bad employee. He was actively lying about my family's financial situation to advance his own interests. Richard, I need you to do something for me. I need you to document everything. Every conversation Joshua has had about inheritance, every client meeting where he's misrepresented his financial backing, Every colleague he's bragged to about his upcoming wealth. Why? Because my daughter deserves to know exactly who she married before she wastes more years of her life on him. Richard nodded slowly. You know, Paul, when I first met you at the wedding, I thought there was something familiar about you. Not just because you're our investor, but something else. You reminded me of my own father. How so? He was a quiet man, worked in a factory his whole life, never made much money, but he had more dignity than anyone I've ever known. He used to tell me that a man's character is revealed not by how he treats his superiors, but by how he treats people who can't do anything for him. I understood what Richard was saying. Joshua treated service workers badly, spoke dismissively about people he considered beneath him, and showed contempt for anyone who couldn't advance his career or social status. Your father sounds like a wise man, I said. He was, and he would have been ashamed of the man I've raised. Richard stood up, straightening his shoulders. Paul, I'm going to do the right thing, not as Joshua's father, but as the CEO of Pemberton Industries. After Richard left, I sat alone in my office, staring at the folder of Joshua's failures. In a few hours, Richard would return to his company and begin the process that would end Joshua's employment. By the end of the week, my son-in-law would be unemployed, his lies exposed, his arrogance finally meeting consequences. But I felt no satisfaction, only a deep sadness for Sophie. She was about to discover that the man she'd married was not who she thought he was. Her world was about to crumble, and there was nothing I could do to prevent that pain. The only thing I could do was make sure I was there to catch her when she fell. The call came on Thursday evening while I was making dinner. Sophie's voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. Dad, can you come over? Joshua's having a dinner party for some of his colleagues, and he insisted you be here. I paused, holding the phone against my ear. He insisted? He said it was time for his work friends to meet his father-in-law properly. He's been telling them about you, about the misunderstanding at the wedding, and he wants to make it right. Something cold settled in my stomach. Joshua knew that Richard and I had met on Tuesday. He knew his job was hanging by a thread. This dinner wasn't about making anything right. It was about something else entirely. Sophie, are you sure you want me there? Please, Dad, he's been different since the wedding. More stressed. He keeps talking about how important this evening is for his career. I could hear the exhaustion in her voice, the strain of trying to keep peace in a marriage that was already fracturing. I'll be there in an hour. The house Joshua and Sophie rented was in an upscale neighborhood, the kind of place that screamed young professional success. As I pulled up in my old pickup truck, I could see expensive cars lining the street. BMWs, Audis, a Tesla. My truck looked like exactly what Joshua wanted his colleagues to think it was. The vehicle of a man who couldn't afford better. Sophie answered the door, and I was shocked by her appearance. She'd lost weight in the 3 weeks since the wedding, and there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. Dad, thank you for coming, she said, hugging me tightly. I know this isn't easy. Hey, I said softly, are you okay? You look tired. I'm fine. It's been a lot, you know? Learning about the money, trying to understand why you kept it secret. Joshua's been helping me process it all. My jaw tightened. I could imagine exactly how Joshua was helping her process the revelation that her father was wealthy. The living room was full of young professionals, all dressed in expensive suits and designer dresses. They looked like the kind of people Joshua desperately wanted to impress, the kind who measured success by brand names and zip codes. Joshua appeared at my side almost immediately, his arms sliding around my shoulders in a gesture that looked friendly but felt possessive. Everyone, I want you to meet my father-in-law, Paul, he announced loudly. The man I was telling you about? The room fell quiet, all eyes turning toward me. I could see the curiosity, the barely concealed amusement, as they took in my simple khakis and button-down shirt, my scuffed work boots, my general appearance of a man who shopped at discount stores. Paul here has had quite a journey, Joshua continued, his voice taking on that condescending tone I'd grown to hate. Lost his job a few years ago, been struggling to get back on his feet. Sophie's been helping him out, haven't you, honey? Sophie's face went pale. Joshua. But the funny thing is, Joshua's grip on my shoulder tightened. At our wedding, Paul here pretended to be some kind of big-shot investor, got my father all confused, claimed he was the mystery partner in our company. Eh? A few people chuckled. I could see Sophie starting to shake. "Joshua, stop," she said quietly, but he wasn't listening. I understand the impulse," Joshua continued, playing to his audience. "When you're unemployed and your daughter's supporting you, it must be tempting to create these fantasies about being successful. But the truth is, Paul hasn't worked a real job in years." The room was completely silent now. Everyone was staring, some with pity, others with the kind of fascination people have when watching a car accident. I looked at Sophie, saw the tears starting to form in her eyes, saw the shame and confusion and pain written across her face. She believed him. After our conversation at the cafe, after learning the truth about my wealth, she still believed Joshua's version of events because he was her husband, and she wanted to trust him. That's when I realized this wasn't just cruelty. This was strategic. Joshua was publicly humiliating me in front of his colleagues to establish his dominance, to show everyone that he was the successful one in the family, the provider, the man in control. He was using my revelation about my wealth against me, twisting it into evidence of my supposed delusions. "Actually," I said quietly, pulling out my phone, "I think it's time we cleared up this misunderstanding once and for all." Joshua's expression flickered with uncertainty. "Paul, please don't—" I dialed Richard Pemberton's direct number. He answered on the second ring. "Richard, it's Paul Henderson. I'm sorry to call so late, but I'm at a gathering with your son and some of his colleagues, and there seems to be some confusion about my role in your company. Would you mind speaking to the group?" I put the phone on speaker before Joshua could object. "Of course, Paul." Richard's voice filled the room, clear and professional. "To whom am I speaking?" "You're on speaker with about 15 people from Pemberton Industries and some associated companies. They're colleagues of your son Joshua." "Ah, excellent. Well, let me be very clear about Paul Henderson's role in our company. Mr. Henderson has been our primary investor and strategic partner for 15 years. He owns 47% of Pemberton Industries and has been instrumental in every major decision that's made our company successful." The silence in the room was deafening. I could see Joshua's face going white, could see his colleagues exchanging glances of confusion and dawning realization. "In fact," Richard continued, "I was just telling my board of directors this morning what a privilege it's been to work with someone of Mr. Henderson's caliber and business acumen. His investment strategies have been nothing short of brilliant." "Thank you, Richard," I said calmly. That's all I needed to clarify. I hung up and looked around the room at the faces staring back at me. The pity had been replaced by shock, the amusement by embarrassment on Joshua's behalf. "Joshua," I said quietly, "I think we need to talk privately." But Joshua wasn't listening. His face was red, his breathing rapid. "This is ridiculous," he said loudly. "You're all believing this charade? He's unemployed. He drives a 20-year-old truck. Look at how he dresses." "Clothes don't make the man, son," said an older gentleman I recognized as one of Richard's board members. "Some of the wealthiest people I know prefer to live modestly." "This is insane," Joshua said, his voice getting higher. "Sophie, tell them. Tell them about your father's apartment, about the money you've been sending him." Sophie was staring at me, her face a mixture of confusion and something that might have been horror as she began to piece together what had been happening. "Joshua," she said slowly, "Dad told me at the cafe that he donated every penny I sent him to charity. He never needed my money." The room was watching this family drama unfold with the fascination of people witnessing something they knew they shouldn't be seeing. I felt deeply uncomfortable having our private pain displayed in front of strangers, but Joshua had chosen this battlefield. "You're all crazy," Joshua said, backing toward the hallway. "He's been lying to you, Sophie. He's been lying to everyone." "Actually," I said, pulling out my wallet and removing a business card, "here's my attorney's number. He can verify my identity and financial status if anyone has questions." I handed the card to the board member who'd spoken up. He glanced at it and his eyebrows rose. "Morrison, Hartley and Associates," he read aloud. "That's one of the most prestigious firms in the city." "They handle all my business affairs," I said simply. Joshua looked around the room desperately, seeking an ally, someone who would back up his version of reality. But his colleagues were looking at him with a mixture of embarrassment and pity, and I could see the exact moment when he realized that his credibility in this room was completely destroyed. "This party is over," he said suddenly. "Everyone needs to leave, now." People began gathering their coats and purses, murmuring awkward goodbyes. Within minutes, the house was empty, except for me, Sophie, and Joshua. Joshua turned on me the moment the last guest left, his face twisted with rage. "You destroyed me tonight. Do you understand that? I'll never be able to show my face at work again." "You destroyed yourself," I said calmly. "I just stopped pretending to be someone I'm not." "This is all your fault," Joshua shouted. "If you hadn't kept this secret, if you'd just been honest from the beginning—" "If I'd been honest from the beginning, you never would have shown me who you really are," I interrupted. "You would have treated me with fake respect while despising me behind my back." Sophie was standing between us, tears streaming down her face. "Stop it, both of you. Just stop." I looked at my daughter, saw the pain and confusion and exhaustion in her eyes, and felt my heart break for her. This wasn't how I'd wanted this to happen. I'd wanted to protect her from this moment, this realization about the man she'd married. But Joshua had forced my hand, and now there was no going back. Joshua was fired the next morning. Richard called me at 8 o'clock to tell me the board had met in emergency session and voted unanimously to terminate Joshua's employment, effective immediately. The final straw had been reports from the dinner party guests about Joshua's behavior, his public lies about company ownership, and his complete lack of professionalism. "I'm sorry it came to this, Paul," Richard said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I tried to protect him, but he made it impossible." "You did the right thing," I told him. "The company comes first." But as I hung up the phone, I felt no satisfaction, only a deep sadness for what was about to happen to my daughter's marriage. Sophie called me an hour later, her voice thick with tears. "Dad, Joshua lost his job. He's saying it's because of what happened last night, because you humiliated him in front of his colleagues." I closed my eyes. "Sophie, Joshua lost his job because he's been performing poorly for months. Last night was just the final incident in a long pattern of unprofessional behavior." "That's not what he's saying. He's saying you used your influence to get him fired out of spite." I could hear Joshua in the background, his voice raised and angry, though I couldn't make out the words. "Where are you now?" I asked. "At home. He's really upset, Dad. He's been drinking since this morning, and he keeps talking about how you've ruined his life." My stomach clenched with worry. "Sophie, I want you to come stay with me for a few days, just until things calm down." "I can't do that. He's my husband, Dad. I took vows. Vows to support each other, not to enable destructive behavior." "Honey, if he's drinking and angry—" "He's not dangerous," Sophie said quickly, but there was something in her voice that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "He's just hurt and confused. This is all happening so fast." "Leah." I wanted to drive over there immediately to see for myself that she was safe, but I knew that would only make things worse. Joshua was already blaming me for everything that had gone wrong in his life. Showing up at his house would be like pouring gasoline on a fire. "Sophie, I want you to promise me something. If you feel unsafe, even for a moment, you call me immediately. Day or night, I'll come get you." "I will, Dad, I promise." But as the days passed, Sophie's calls became less frequent. When she did answer her phone, she sounded increasingly tired and stressed. Joshua had convinced her that they needed to work through this crisis together without outside interference, which apparently included limiting contact with her father. 2 weeks after Joshua's termination, I was working in my office when my assistant buzzed me. "Mr. Henderson, there's a Sophie Pemberton here to see you. She says she's your daughter." Sophie Pemberton. She was using Joshua's last name, even though they'd only been married a month. That small detail told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly Joshua had isolated her from her own identity. When Sophie walked into my office, I was shocked by her appearance. She'd lost even more weight, and there was a brittle quality to her movements that reminded me of someone trying very hard to hold herself together. "Dad, we need to talk," she said, sitting down across from my desk with careful precision. "Of course," How are you doing, sweetheart? I'm fine, she said automatically, but her hands were shaking as she placed them in her lap. I came here to ask you to give Joshua his job back. I stared at her. Sophie? He's a good man, Dad. He made some mistakes, but everyone deserves a second chance. He's been working so hard to find another position, but word has gotten around about what happened at Pemberton Industries. No one will hire him. I leaned forward, studying my daughter's face. Has he been looking for work, or has he been drinking? Sophie's carefully controlled expression cracked slightly. That's not fair. He's been under a lot of stress. Answer the question, Sophie. How much has he been drinking? She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. He says it helps him think clearly about his career options. My heart broke for her. She was making excuses for him, trying to rationalize behavior that was probably getting worse by the day. Sophie, I can't give Joshua his job back. Even if I wanted to, the board would never approve it after what happened. Then use your influence somewhere else. You're wealthy. You must know people at other companies. I shook my head. I won't use my connections to help someone get a job they haven't earned and probably can't handle. Sophie's composure finally shattered. He was right about you, she said, tears streaming down her face. He said you'd never help us, that you'd use your money as a weapon to control our lives. Is that what you think I'm doing? I don't know what to think anymore, she sobbed. Everything I thought I knew was a lie. You're rich, but you let me struggle through nursing school. You let me worry about you for years. You let me send you money I could barely afford. And now you won't help my husband when he needs it most. I came around the desk and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in mine. Sophie, I kept my wealth secret because I wanted you to become strong and independent. I wanted you to know you could take care of yourself, that you didn't need anyone else's money to survive. But I did need it, she whispered. I worked 2 jobs through school. I ate ramen noodles for dinner most nights. I wore the same clothes until they fell apart. And look what you became. You're a skilled nurse who saves lives every day. You're compassionate and hardworking and resilient. Would you have developed those qualities if everything had been handed to you? She pulled her hands away from mine. I don't know. I'll never know, will I? Because you made that choice for me. I felt something break inside my chest. In trying to protect her, in trying to give her strength, I had caused her years of unnecessary struggle and worry. And now that struggle was being weaponized against our relationship by a man who saw her pain as an opportunity for manipulation. Sophie, what do you want me to do? Tell me how to fix this. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I want you to help Joshua find a job. I want you to stop punishing him for being honest about his feelings. His feelings? He told me he was intimidated by you from the beginning. He knew you were judging him, looking down on him, so he tried to impress you by acting more successful than he was. I stared at my daughter, seeing how completely Joshua had rewritten their history. In his version, he was the victim of my judgment rather than the perpetrator of years of emotional abuse. He had turned his cruelty into self-defense, his arrogance into insecurity. Sophie, Joshua called me an unemployed loser at your wedding. He spent 2 years telling you that I was an embarrassment to his career. How was that being intimidated? Because he was scared, she said, as if this explained everything. He was scared of not being good enough for our family. I realized then that Joshua had won. He had successfully convinced my daughter that his behavior was justified, that I was the problem, that their marriage troubles were my fault for keeping secrets and wielding my wealth like a weapon. Standing up slowly, I walked back to my desk and pulled out my checkbook. I wrote a check for $50,000 and handed it to Sophie. What's this? She asked. Enough money to give you time to figure out what you really want. You can use it to support Joshua while he looks for work, or you can use it to start over on your own. That choice is yours. Sophie stared at the check, her hands trembling. Dad, I love you, Sophie. More than money, more than pride, more than being right. But I won't enable someone who treats you badly, even if that someone is your husband. She folded the check and put it in her purse, then stood up to leave. At the door, she turned back to me. He says you'll try to turn me against him eventually. He says rich people always think money gives them the right to control other people's lives. And what do you think? Sophie was quiet for a moment. I think I married a man I'm still trying to understand, and I lost a father I thought I knew. After she left, I sat alone in my office for a long time, staring out the window at the city below. I had achieved exactly what I'd set out to do. Joshua had faced consequences for his behavior, lost his job, been exposed as a liar and a manipulator. But the victory felt hollow because it had cost me my relationship with my daughter. 6 months later, Sophie filed for divorce. She never told me directly. I learned about it from Richard Pemberton, who heard it through his social circle. Joshua had apparently spent the $50,000 I'd given them on a failed business venture and increased drinking, becoming increasingly bitter and difficult to live with. The divorce was finalized quietly, with no drama and no fanfare. Joshua moved back in with his parents, his career in ruins, his reputation destroyed by his own actions, and Sophie came home. She knocked on my apartment door on a Tuesday evening, looking like herself again for the first time in months. She'd gained back the weight she'd lost, and there was color in her cheeks. "Hi, Dad," she said simply. I hugged her tightly, not trusting myself to speak. "I'm sorry," she whispered into my shoulder. "I'm sorry I chose him over you. I'm sorry I believed his lies about what kind of man you are." "You don't have anything to apologize for," I told her. "You were trying to save your marriage. That's what good people do." We talked for hours that night, really talked for the first time since before her wedding. She told me about the months of Joshua's drinking and anger, about how he'd gradually isolated her from friends and family, about how he'd used my money to fund increasingly desperate schemes to reclaim his former lifestyle. "The worst part," she said, "was realizing that everything you tried to teach me about character and values, I forgot the moment I fell in love with someone who represented everything you'd warned me against." "Love makes us blind sometimes," I said. "It's not a character flaw, it's human nature." Sophie curled up on my old couch, looking around the modest apartment I'd refused to give up despite my wealth. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Anything. Now that I know the truth about the money, would you consider buying a better couch? This one is really uncomfortable." I laughed, really laughed. "For the first time in months, I think that can be arranged." 6 months after that, Sophie moved into a small house I bought for her near the hospital where she worked. She threw herself back into nursing with renewed passion, volunteering for extra shifts and training programs, rebuilding the confidence that Joshua had systematically undermined. As for Joshua, I heard through Richard that he eventually found work at a small firm in another city, having learned enough humility from his fall to actually perform his job adequately. He never contacted Sophie or me again, which was probably for the best. I kept my wealth and continued living modestly, but I was more open about my success with Sophie. We had dinner together every Sunday, and sometimes she would ask me about my business dealings or investment strategies. She never asked for money beyond what I'd already given her, but she seemed genuinely interested in understanding the world I'd built. One Sunday, as we sat in her kitchen sharing a simple meal, Sophie looked at me with Margaret's eyes and smiled. "You know, Dad, I think I finally understand why you kept the money secret." "Oh?" "It wasn't about teaching me to work hard, though that was part of it. It was about making sure that when someone claimed to love me, I'd know it was really me they loved, not what I could give them." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become, even after all the mistakes I made. Especially after the mistakes. That's when character really shows. Not when everything's going well, but when everything falls apart and you have to rebuild." Sophie smiled, the same radiant smile that had lit up her wedding day before everything went wrong. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetheart. Always." Outside, the sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. I was 62 years old, wealthy beyond most people's dreams, and sitting in a small kitchen with my daughter, sharing a meal, and feeling richer than I'd ever felt in my life. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being there when the people you love finally come home.